He pissed in your soup. Those 5 words, scrawled in frantic, jagged letters on a cocktail napkin, were a declaration of war. They landed on the table with the quiet devastation of a bomb, stopping Serafina James, a woman who moved markets and dismantled corporations before breakfast, dead in her tracks. The silver spoon, carrying a rich, sherry-laced bisque, froze an inch from her lips, for a woman who had shattered glass ceilings made of reinforced steel, who had faced down hostile boardrooms filled with men who looked at her like a statistical error. This was a different kind of violence. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a desecration. And it was about to detonate a story so dark, so rotten, it would threaten to burn an entire empire to the ground. Before we rip the gilded facade off this whole damn story, I need you to do something for me. Lean in close. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell here aren't the ones you see on the 6 o'clock news. They're the ones whispered in back alleys and written on crumpled napkins. The ones that matter. Now, take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear will curdle your stomach and set your soul on fire. Serafina didn't come to the gilded cage for the soup. She came for the truth, disguised in a way she hadn't been in over 2 decades. Anonymous. Dressed in a faded hoodie she'd bought at a thrift store, a pair of worn-out jeans, and scuffed combat boots, she was investigating a poison that spreadsheets and quarterly reports could never detect. An anonymous email had landed in her private inbox a week prior, a desperate plea from an employee at the high-end Savannah restaurant she had acquired in a portfolio deal 3 years ago. The email spoke of deeply ingrained racial bias, degrading kitchen practices, and a culture of entitled cruelty. Serafina James had built her billion-dollar tech and investment empire, Phoenix Rising, on one principle: cut out the rot before it spreads. She could have sent a team of auditors, lawyers, a whole damn army in suits. But Serafina knew some poisons can only be seen when you're willing to taste them yourself. She wanted to see it raw. No entourage, no reservations, no mercy. From the second she pushed open the ridiculously heavy, ornate doors, she could feel the sickness in the air. It was a lie wrapped in velvet and chandeliers. The hostess, a blonde woman with a smile as brittle as spun sugar, gave her a head-to-toe scan that was less a greeting and more of an extermination assessment. It was a look Serafina knew intimately from a life lived long ago, a look that said, "You don't belong here." She was seated not in the grand dining hall, but in a forgotten corner table, a piece of social Siberia tucked away by the service entrance, where the rhythmic swoosh of the kitchen doors was her dining companion. For 15 agonizing minutes, she was rendered invisible. Servers floated past her like ghosts, their smiles and attention reserved for the tables adorned with Rolexes and old money. And now this. A napkin, a secret grenade, slid onto her table by a young waiter with terror in his eyes and a tremor in his hand. His name was Elias. He didn't ask for a damn thing. He just offered her the ugly, unvarnished truth. And that truth was about to peel back the skin on a system so polished on the outside and so putrid on the inside, it would make your head spin. What would you do? What would you do if you held that kind of filth in your hand, knowing you owned the very ground it was served on? Stick around, because this isn't just a story about bad soup. It's a story about the courage it takes to burn down your own house just to kill the rats. This is a story about the hidden architecture of hate that still props up America's finest institutions. And it all started with one young man who risked everything to do the one thing he wasn't supposed to: tell the truth to a black woman in a hoodie. Serafina James was a master of turning other people's underestimations into her greatest weapon. At 48, she was a specter in the world of high finance and tech, a ghost who left a trail of billion-dollar acquisitions and shattered expectations in her wake. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a strategist, a predator who had learned to hunt in a world that saw her as prey. Raised in the forgotten, rusted-out neighborhoods of Detroit by a grandmother who worked 2 jobs cleaning houses for the rich, Serafina had learned early that the world was divided into those who owned the house and those who cleaned it. Her first computer was a discarded model she'd pieced together from scraps. Her first algorithm, the one that would eventually become the cornerstone of her empire, was coded on sleepless nights fueled by cheap coffee and a burning, relentless need to prove everyone wrong. Success hadn't erased the memories of poverty and prejudice. It had simply sharpened them into weapons. On paper, she was the founder and CEO of Phoenix Rising, a sprawling investment firm with stakes in everything from sustainable energy to bleeding-edge AI, and, ironically, luxury hospitality. She lived in a minimalist penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, drove an unassuming electric sedan, and sat on boards where she was often the only woman, and almost always the only black person. She didn't wear her wealth. No flashy jewelry, no designer logos. Serafina understood that for a black woman in her position, power was projected not through what she wore, but through the unnerving precision of her silence, the surgical strike of her words. She knew how people judged a book by its cover, and she had learned to write a whole new story inside. So when that email arrived, bypassing layers of executive assistants to land directly in her private inbox, it felt less like a complaint, and more like a ghost from her past reaching out to grab her. The email, written with a desperate eloquence, spoke of a restaurant that operated on an unspoken apartheid. Black customers were routinely seated in the worst sections, given slower service, and overcharged for mistakes on their bills. Black employees were kept in back-of-house roles, passed over for promotions, and subjected to a constant barrage of casual, soul-crushing racism. It was a story she knew in her bones. She didn't forward it to HR. She didn't delegate it to her chief operating officer. She booked a flight to Savannah under an assumed name, packed a bag with clothes she hadn't worn since college, and walked straight into the belly of the beast. Nobody knew she was coming. That was the entire point. To see the real face of a monster, you can't announce your arrival. You have to become invisible, blend into the shadows. Serafina wasn't just a CEO, she was a mirror, and she was about to force this beautiful, ugly restaurant to take a long, hard look at its own reflection. Because true power isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what everyone else is paid to ignore. The gilded cage was designed to make you feel small. It was carved out of an old cotton baron's mansion on a cobblestone square in Savannah, a place that reeked of history and money. The air inside was thick with the scent of beeswax, old leather, and an unspoken agreement of exclusivity. Towering ceilings dripped with crystal chandeliers, and the walls were covered in dark, mahogany paneling, adorned with massive, oil-painted portraits of stern-faced white men from the 1800s, conveniently leaving out the source of their immense wealth. The restaurant's name was a nod to its opulent decor, but to Serafina, sitting in her forgotten corner, it felt suffocatingly literal. It was a beautiful prison of appearances. You didn't just come here to eat. You came here to confirm your place in the social hierarchy. The performance began at the door. The hostess's polite smile never quite reached her eyes as she looked Serafina up and down. The calculation was swift and brutal. Hoodie, jeans, black woman, alone. Not a threat, just an inconvenience. Do you have a reservation? The question was a formality. The dismissal was already in her tone. No, Serafina answered, her voice even and calm. The hostess sighed, a little puff of performative annoyance. Well, we are quite busy this evening. I might have a table over there. She gestured vaguely toward the service corridor, a corner so undesirable it wasn't even considered part of the main dining room. "Will that be acceptable?" "Perfect," Serafina said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. She followed the hostess across a sea of plush crimson carpet, past tables buzzing with the low hum of Savannah's elite. White faces, old and new money, laughing, drinking, being seen. The only other black faces she saw belonged to the busboys, moving silently and efficiently along the periphery, their presence as functional and unnoticed as the silverware. Some things, it seemed, never changed. The table was small, wobbly, and offered a direct view into the chaotic, sweating heart of the kitchen every time the doors swung open, releasing a blast of heat and the sharp smell of cleaning chemicals. The hostess dropped a leather-bound menu onto the table without a word and vanished. For the next 15 minutes, Serafina simply sat and observed. She watched the manager, a man named Alistair Finch with slicked-back silver hair and a condescending posture, glide between tables, his laughter booming, his handshakes firm. His eyes, however, swept right past Serafina's table as if it were an empty space, a glitch in the opulent matrix. Waiters refilled wine glasses and explained the chef's specials with theatrical flair to the other guests, while she sat with an empty water glass. The gilded cage wasn't failing. It was operating with terrifying precision, a perfectly calibrated machine designed to sort, stratify, and subtly humiliate anyone who didn't fit the mold. And Serafina, the silent observer, the billionaire in beggar's clothing, saw it for exactly what it was. Not a restaurant, but a stage, where history put on a fine suit and called itself tradition. Elias Vance moved through the opulent dining room like a man trying to walk on water. At 22, he possessed a quiet, almost haunted grace, the kind that comes from carrying burdens far too heavy for your age. He had the hands of a guitarist, long, calloused fingers, and the eyes of a poet, though most days they just looked tired. His dream was to make music, to write songs that told the stories of the people the world forgot. But dreams didn't pay the rent for the tiny apartment he shared with his two younger sisters, not since their mother had passed away 2 years ago. So he put his guitar in its case, tucked his dreams into the back of his mind, and put on the starched white uniform of a waiter at the gilded cage. The job paid the bills, but it cost him a piece of his soul every night. He was one of only 2 black servers on the floor, a token hire that Mr. Finch liked to point to as evidence of their diversity. But Elias felt the truth in the scheduling. He was always given the worst sections. He felt it in the condescending tone Finch used when correcting him in front of guests. He felt it in the way the kitchen staff, led by the arrogant Chef Antoine, would switch to French to tell racist jokes they thought he couldn't understand. He understood every word. He just swallowed the bitterness, polished the silverware, and said, "Yes, sir," and "Right away, ma'am," with a smile that felt like a mask hardening on his face. He wasn't weak. He was a survivor. He was watching, listening, and filing away every single injustice in a mental ledger that was growing heavier by the day. But tonight, something was different. The woman at table 32, the one tucked away by the kitchen, didn't fit. She didn't have the restless, entitled energy of the other patrons. She sat with a profound stillness, an unnerving calm, her eyes absorbing everything. When he finally approached her table to take her order, after being explicitly told by Finch to let her wait, she looked up at him, and her gaze was so direct, so penetrating, it felt like she could see right through his uniform, past the tired waiter, and into the heart of the frustrated musician beneath. It was a look of recognition. And in that brief, silent moment, something inside Elias, something he thought had been extinguished, flickered back to life. He didn't know who she was, but he knew she didn't belong to this world of polite cruelty. And for the first time, he felt an overwhelming urge not just to serve, but to protect. Tonight, he was done just watching. He was about to step onto the stage, even if it meant bringing the whole damn theater crashing down. The governor's feast was less a meal and more an act of obscene theater. It was a 3-tiered platter featuring a whole poached lobster, a mound of Osetra caviar nestled in an ice sculpture of a swan, and a 32-ounce tomahawk steak encrusted with edible gold leaf. It came with a personal sommelier, a tableside carving, and a price tag that could feed a family of 4 for a month. $950. It was a dish designed for arrogance, not appetite. When the woman at table 32 ordered it, her voice was quiet but firm. Elias's pen froze over his notepad. The governor's feast, ma'am?" he stammered, his professional composure cracking. She simply nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "And a bottle of the Screaming Eagle, the 92. Another gut punch, a $12,000 bottle of wine. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He had only ever seen that bottle on the wine list. He'd assumed it was a myth, a prop. He had taken orders for the feast before, always from blowhard politicians or tech bros trying to impress a date, never from a woman in a hoodie sitting at the worst table in the house. He could feel the weight of Mr. Finch's gaze from across the room, a palpable pressure on the back of his neck. He knew the unwritten rule. For an order this extravagant from a customer, this unexpected, you were required to get a credit card for pre-authorization before the kitchen even fired up the grill. It was a humiliating policy, and it was applied with surgical prejudice. He hesitated for a heartbeat too long. "Is there a problem?" the woman asked, her voice still soft, but now with an underlying edge of sharpened steel. "No, ma'am," Elias said, a sudden reckless courage surging through him. "Not at all. Excellent choice." He turned and walked toward the POS terminal, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was supposed to go to Finch to subject this woman to the indignity of proving she could afford her meal. But he couldn't do it. He looked back at her quiet, powerful stillness, and made a decision. He keyed in the order, and when the screen flashed with the inevitable "Manager Approval Required" prompt, he took a deep breath, swiped his own employee card, and hit the override. He had just personally vouched for a $13,000 dinner order on nothing more than a gut feeling. He hadn't taken 2 steps toward the kitchen before Finch's voice hissed behind him, low and venomous. "Vance, did you get a card from her?" "The order is in, sir," Elias replied, keeping his back to him. "You better pray to whatever God you believe in that she pays, boy," Finch snarled, "because if she walks, that's coming out of your hide." But Elias wasn't praying. He was watching, because he had a growing suspicion that this woman wasn't here to be judged. She was here to be the judge. And if that was true, she was about to witness the full, unadulterated depravity of the gilded cage. Elias had seen ugly things in that kitchen. He'd seen servers get their tips stolen, seen busboys berated until they cried, seen health codes bent to the breaking point. But what he saw next would be seared into his memory forever. When he pushed through the swinging doors, he saw Chef Antoine standing over the grill, where the magnificent tomahawk steak was sizzling. Antoine, a man whose culinary talent was matched only by his profound arrogance and prejudice, saw the order ticket with table 32 on it and let out a derisive snort. "The governor's feast, for the charity case in the corner?" he sneered to his sous chef, who chuckled obediently. Elias watched, frozen in the doorway, partially hidden by a stack of bus tubs. He saw Antoine look around the kitchen, a cruel, conspiratorial grin spreading across his face. And then he did it. With a quiet, deliberate motion, he unzipped his fly. The act was so shocking, so utterly depraved, that for a second, Elias's brain refused to process it. Antoine pissed directly onto the searing hot steak. A plume of acrid steam hissed up, the sound mixing with the sous chef's sick laughter. "A little juice for our special guest," Antoine chortled, zipping himself up and flipping the steak with a flourish, as if nothing had happened. The world went silent. The clatter of pans, the shouting of orders, it all faded into a dull roar in Elias's ears. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a prank. This was a violation so profound, so hateful, it felt like a physical blow. Rage, hot and pure, rose in his throat, choking him. But he couldn't scream. He couldn't run out and expose them. They would deny it. He would be fired. And this woman would be served a meal that had been defiled in the most disgusting way imaginable. He looked through the porthole window in the door and saw her, still sitting, still watching, a solitary island of calm in a sea of blissful ignorance. They didn't know who she was, but Elias was starting to believe she was someone who mattered. And that belief changed everything. He had seconds, a choice that would define him. Say nothing and become complicit in their filth, or act and risk everything, his job, his sister's security, his future. His hand dove into his apron, fumbling for his service pen. He snatched a clean cocktail napkin from the bar station. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely form the letters. The ink bled into the soft paper, a desperate, ugly stain. "He pissed in your soup." A lie, but a more digestible one than the full truth. It was a gateway to the horror. He added another line. "This place is poison. Kitchen cams 8:15 p.m. Trust no one. No name, no signature. Just the raw, explosive truth." He folded it into a tight square as the gold-leafed steak was plated, a grotesque parody of luxury. The platter was handed to him. His heart pounded a frantic, suffocating rhythm against his ribs as he walked it through the dining room. Every eye felt like it was on him. He approached table 32, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional neutrality. Serafina looked up. With hands he prayed were steady, he placed the monstrous platter before her. "Your governor's feast, ma'am," he murmured, his voice a stranger's in his own ears. As he reached to clear her unused bread plate with his left hand, his right hand, quick as a serpent, slipped the folded napkin right beside her water glass. A fraction of a second. No eye contact. Then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the restaurant, leaving the small white napkin on the table like an unexploded landmine. For a full minute, Serafina James did not move. She stared at the folded napkin as if it were radioactive. She hadn't touched the platter of food that sat before her like a golden calf. Something in the waiter's eyes, a flash of pure, undiluted terror, had screamed at her to wait. It was a silent, desperate signal that had bypassed language and gone straight to her gut. With a slow, deliberate movement that belied the sudden Arctic chill flooding her veins, she picked up the napkin. She unfolded it under the table, shielded from any watching eyes. The words were a punch to the diaphragm. Jagged. Urgent. Vile. He pissed in your soup. This place is poison. Kitchen cams 8:15 p.m. Trust no one. Her jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped along her cheek. Every bit of air left her lungs. It wasn't the act itself, as disgusting as it was, that reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. It was the two words that followed. This place. That wasn't about one rogue chef. That was about the whole damn system. It was about the soil from which this sickness grew. Elias, she remembered his name from his tag, wasn't just warning her about a meal. He was handing her the key to the entire rotten kingdom. He was sounding the alarm for a 5-alarm fire that had been burning just beneath the floorboards. Serafina carefully folded the napkin and slipped it into the deep pocket of her hoodie. Then she pushed the $950 platter of food away. the gold leaf mocking her with its empty shine. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't summon the manager. Not yet. Theatrics were for amateurs. She reached for the cheap, untraceable burner phone she used for these trips and opened a triple encrypted messaging app. A few quick, precise taps, and a message shot across the country to the head of her personal security team, a former Mossad agent who operated with terrifying efficiency. Code Black. The Gilded Cage, Savannah. Need immediate remote acquisition of all internal security footage backups from the cloud servers for tonight. Raw files only. Cross-reference all kitchen staff against employee complaints database. Total discretion. Full report in my inbox within the hour. Then she stood up. Across the opulent room, Mr. Finch noticed her movement. His expression was a mixture of annoyance and nervous anticipation. He started toward her, a fake smile already forming on his lips, likely expecting a complaint about the wait time. "Is there a problem with your meal?" Finch asked, his voice oozing a condescending charm. Serafina's voice was unnervingly quiet, but it cut through the dining room chatter like a shard of ice. "I need to speak with you. In your office. Now." The smile on Finch's face faltered. He gestured nervously toward a hallway. "Of course, if you'll just follow me." Inside the cramped, cluttered office, Serafina remained standing. She let Finch launch into a pre-packaged speech about maintaining the highest standards and unparalleled guest experiences. It was meaningless noise, a smoke screen. Serafina let him talk for exactly 30 seconds before she cut him off. "Show me the kitchen security footage from 8:15 this evening." Finch froze. I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," she said. And in that instant, the disguise of the woman in the hoodie evaporated. The quiet observer was gone. In her place stood the CEO, the predator, and her eyes were cold with a promise of absolute annihilation. "The cameras. Now!" Finch sputtered, scrambling for an excuse. "Well, the cameras are primarily for security and inventory. I'm not sure they would be relevant to a service complaint." "I didn't say it was a complaint," Serafina said, taking a slow step closer. Finch instinctively took a step back, bumping into his desk. "Let's be very clear, Mr. Finch. I'm giving you one opportunity to be the man who helps me solve a problem. Your only other option is to be the man who becomes part of it. Your choice." His face, already pale, turned the color of chalk. Still, his instinct for self-preservation and deceit was strong. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I must ask who you are to be making such demands." Serafina leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a whisper that was louder than any shout. "I'm the woman who signs the checks that pay for your slicked-back hair, your cheap suit, and this entire gilded lie of a restaurant. I am the owner of this building, this brand, and, until 5 minutes ago, your employment. Now, for the last time, show me the goddamn footage." Finch's mouth opened and closed like a fish on a hook. Defeated, he stumbled over to a monitor, his hands shaking as he typed in a password. He pulled up the archived footage, scrolling frantically. The moment the feed from the grill station appeared, Serafina's arms crossed over her chest. Finch clicked play. The footage ran for 10 seconds, and then a jump. A clean, surgical cut. 2 minutes and 34 seconds of time simply vanished, the exact time window when the steak would have been prepared. Finch feigned surprise. "Oh dear. It seems there's a glitch in the local server recording. Sometimes it loops to save space." Serafina stopped him with a single word. "Enough." Outside the office, the performance of the Gilded Cage continued. Laughter, clinking glasses, the illusion of perfection. Inside, the silence was a tomb. Serafina pulled out her burner phone again and fired off a second message to her team. Local footage has been deliberately tampered with. Manager Alistair Finch is complicit. Preserve all communications. I want a full background and financial workup on him. And head chef Antoine Dubois. Now. She slipped the phone away and turned her gaze back to the sweating, terrified man behind the desk. "You're finished for the night, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Walk me to the front door, then go home. And if I were you, I'd spend the rest of the night calling a very good lawyer." Mr. Finch didn't know it yet, but the storm had already made landfall. The wind was howling, the walls were beginning to creak, and the gilded door of his cage had just been ripped clean off its hinges. The drive back to the sterile luxury of her hotel suite was a silent, coiled fury. Serafina didn't see the moss-draped oaks or the historic beauty of Savannah. She saw a battleground. By the time she walked through the door, her tablet chimed. Her security team had delivered. They had bypassed the local, compromised server and pulled the raw, unedited, high-definition footage directly from the off-site cloud backup. What Finch and his chef had tried to bury was now sitting in a secure file on her screen. She poured a glass of ice water, her hand perfectly steady, sat at the desk overlooking the sleeping city, and pressed play. There it was. Time-stamped. Undeniable. Crystal clear. Chef Antoine leaning over the steak. The smirk. The glance to the sous chef. The disgusting, deliberate act. The faint but clear audio picked up his words, laced with a thick, arrogant accent. This is what happens when they forget their place. The sous chef's braying laugh was the punctuation mark. Serafina felt no shock. There was no hot flash of outrage. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a strategist whose worst suspicions have been confirmed. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was a ritual. This was a system of humiliation. A quiet little pocket of hate thriving in one of her own assets. Her team had already appended older files to the report. The digital records were damning. Footage from the previous week showed a black family being ignored for 20 minutes, only to have their food intentionally oversalted in the kitchen. Audio logs caught Finch telling the hostess to always seat our kind of people in the main room first. It wasn't an incident. It was an unwritten policy. She encrypted the video files, sending one copy to her chief legal counsel and another to her head of PR, a woman known for her scorched earth crisis management tactics. The included directive was simple and brutal. Full legal and civil proceedings. Staff interviews to begin at 9 a.m., identify all co-conspirators, draft a public statement. No one breathes a word of this to the media until I give the order. She stood and looked out the panoramic window. They thought they were spitting on a poor, anonymous black woman. They thought they were reinforcing their pathetic little hierarchy of hate. But they hadn't humiliated her. They had armed her. They had exposed the sickness. And Serafina James was not a doctor who healed. She was a surgeon who cut out the cancer, bone and all. The story was no longer about a plate of food. It was about justice. A reckoning was coming to Savannah, and it would arrive without invitation and without mercy. The next morning, Elias Vance walked to work with a knot of dread in his stomach so tight he could barely breathe. He hadn't slept. Every creak of his apartment building, every siren in the distance, had been the sound of his life falling apart. He was sure that by now the woman was gone. Finch had reviewed the cameras, and he was a dead man walking. He expected to be met at the employee entrance by security. He expected his final paycheck and a threat. Instead, the back door was unlocked. The morning prep was underway as usual. No one looked at him twice. It was a terrifying, unnerving normality, until the hostess found him by the coffee station. Her eyes were wide. "Mr. Finch's office," she whispered. Right now. This was it. Elias wiped his sweaty palms on his apron, straightened his shoulders, and took the long, lonely walk down the hall. He pushed the door open, preparing to face Finch's wrath. But Finch wasn't there. She was. Serafina James. Still in the same hoodie and jeans, but today she wasn't sitting. She was standing behind the desk as if she owned it, which he was beginning to realize she did. The air in the room was electric. "Elias Vance," she said. Her voice was different today. Still quiet, but layered with an authority that was absolute. She motioned to the chair in front of the desk. He remained standing. I know what they did," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do." She held up a hand, silencing him. "What you did," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "was the only thing that mattered." His heart skipped a beat. Am I fired?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Not by me," she said. "I own this company, Elias. The entire portfolio, the buildings, the brands, the paychecks, everything." His legs went weak. He sank into the chair. "I've seen the real footage," she continued, her voice cold and precise. "I've seen what Antoine did. I've seen what Finch covered up. I've seen what's been happening in this kitchen, in this dining room for far too long." Elias looked down at his hands. "I felt so trapped." "You weren't trapped. You were a witness," she countered. "And you chose to testify. Most people don't. They look away." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the small room. "So now I'm giving you a choice. I can burn this place to the ground, fire every last person, sell the property, and erase the gilded cage from the map. And I will, if I have to. But before I do that, I need to know where you stand." Elias looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "You can walk away," she said plainly. "I'll write you a check that will take care of you and your sisters for the next 10 years. I'll pay to put you through any music school in the country. You never have to think about this place again. You've earned it." It was a dream, an escape hatch from a life he was beginning to hate. But then she offered the alternative. "Or," she said, leaning forward, her eyes intense, You can stay and help me rebuild it. Help me turn this cage into a sanctuary. I'm creating a new position, Director of Culture and Community. Someone whose sole job is to ensure that every single person who walks through that door, employee or guest, is treated with dignity. Someone to oversee training, to manage an anonymous reporting system, to be the soul of this restaurant. Silence stretched between them. Elias's voice was hoarse. "You would trust me with that?" Serafina nodded slowly. "Elias, when you slid that napkin onto my table, you trusted me with the truth. Now I'm just trusting you back." And for the first time in 2 years, since the day his mother had died, Elias Vance felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to lift. He took a breath, not of the stale, recycled air of the office, but a deep, clean breath of a future he had never dared to imagine. The 24 hours that followed were a masterclass in controlled demolition. By noon, the Gilded Cage was no longer a restaurant. It was the epicenter of a corporate earthquake. Serafina moved with the swift, lethal grace of a hurricane. Quiet calls were made. Ironclad plans were executed. Her legal and HR teams, flown in from Chicago on a private jet before dawn, had set up a command center in a nearby hotel. At exactly 12:30 p.m., as the first of the lunchtime regulars began to arrive, 2 unmarked sedans pulled up to the curb. 4 men in crisp, dark suits stepped out. They weren't police, but they carried the unmistakable authority of federal agents. They were from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, accompanied by Serafina's chief litigator. They walked past the stunned hostess and went straight for the kitchen. Chef Antoine was caught mid-bravado, berating a line cook. He didn't even have time to take off his apron before he was being informed he was the subject of a major civil rights investigation. He was escorted out the front door in full view of the patrons. The sous chef was next. Then, Mr. Finch was quietly removed from his office. 3 men, who had ruled their little kingdom with impunity just yesterday, were dismantled without a single raised voice. The rest of the staff stood in stunned silence. Some were terrified. Some looked relieved. A few of the busboys shared a quiet, triumphant look. Outside, a podium had been erected on the restaurant's steps. The media, tipped off by Serafina's PR team, were already swarming. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved forward. Serafina stepped up to the podium, not with anger, but with a cold, clear-eyed resolve. "Yesterday, I walked into this establishment as a customer," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, I stand before you as its owner. And I am here to tell you that the culture we discovered inside this restaurant is a cancer. It is a betrayal of the community of Savannah and a betrayal of the values of my company, Phoenix Rising." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the reporters. This was not the result of one bad apple. This was a diseased orchard, and we are here to uproot it. She then turned and gestured to Elias, who stood just behind her, dressed in a simple but sharp new suit. He looked terrified but resolute. "This young man, Elias Vance," Serafina announced, her voice ringing with conviction, "showed more courage and integrity with one small act than the entire previous management team did in their careers. He is the reason we are here today. He is the reason this truth came to light. And he will be a core part of this institution's future as we rebuild it from the ashes." A wave of applause, genuine and surprised, rippled through the crowd. Serafina concluded with a final, sharp statement. "The gilded cage is closed, effective immediately. But we are not running away. We are cleansing. We are rebuilding. And when we reopen, we will have a new name, a new mission, and a new promise to this city. That our doors will be open to everyone, and our culture will be one of respect, not just for those in the dining room, but for the talented people in our kitchen and on our floor. This restaurant will no longer be a monument to a painful past. It will be a testament to a better future. No spin, no corporate doublespeak, just the raw, unshielded truth, broadcast for the entire world to see." It wasn't a press conference that changed things. It wasn't the lawsuits or the headlines or the firings. It was a cocktail napkin, a single flimsy piece of paper folded into a square, delivered in terror and received in silence. That's all it took to detonate a hidden world of cruelty, a culture of hate that masqueraded as fine dining. One simple, terrifying act of courage didn't just light a match. It threw a torch into a room drenched in gasoline. And the ensuing fire didn't destroy everything. It burned away the lies, revealing the rot that had been there all along. What is the lesson here? It isn't just about bad chefs or racist managers. It's about the silent, everyday courage of people you'd never notice. Elias Vance had no power. He had no title, no influence, no safety net. But he had a conscience. He saw something evil. And instead of looking away, instead of telling himself it wasn't his problem, he acted. He didn't shout. He didn't lead a protest. He wrote down the truth and passed it to the one person he thought might actually listen. And that is the other, more important half of this story. Serafina James had all the power in the world, and she did the one thing that people in power so rarely do. She listened. She believed him. She used her immense power not to protect her asset or her brand, but to validate his truth and unleash a righteous justice. An empire didn't crumble that day. It was reborn. So, I'll leave you with this question. How many napkins have been passed to you that you've ignored? What quiet injustices have you witnessed and dismissed because it was easier to stay silent? And what incredible change might be possible if you decided to act? If this story shook something loose inside you, if it reminded you that your voice matters, then do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that integrity is a superpower. And if you want more true stories like this one, the raw, unfiltered kind that challenge everything you think you know, then subscribe to this channel. Because changing the world doesn't always start with a roar. Sometimes it starts with a whisper written on a napkin and someone brave enough to read it.